The Denver Broncos released their first unofficial depth chart with rookie quarterback Bo Nix coming in as QB3. We'll tell you why you shouldn't read anything into that here on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, Broncos Country? Welcome into yet another episode of the show. I'm Cody Roark, credentialed Broncos reporter from Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by Sayre Bedinger, the longtime site expert and voice for Broncos Country. Sayre brings the heat every single day. And look, we bring the heat here on Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And look, we got a lot to talk about here on today's episode of the show. The first unofficial depth chart being released here, but today's episode is brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel. Make every moment more. Check out FanDuel.com to get started with bonuses all summer long because FanDuel is hooking you up. So what are you going to get on today's installment of the show? Well, Broncos Country, there are several young defensive backs who are standing out on a consistent basis at practice that give us a little bit of insight into the Broncos' overall depth and how it could be stronger this upcoming season. Plus, there's a surprise rookie wide receiver who's consistently been impressing during training camp. We'll highlight him, but more importantly, we'll kick things off with the unofficial depth chart coming out. Bo Nix, QB3. Sayre, what should we talk about when it comes to the unofficial depth chart following practice here on Tuesday?
Well, I kind of feel like Sean Payton is doing a little bit of a troll job here. I know that it's pretty typical of NFL teams to they have to put out these depth charts, right? It's not something that they all really want to do, but they have to do it according to the league. So what Sean Payton said after practice, I think, is absolutely true. That he's just kind of taking 5 minutes and throwing things together, and you throw all the rookies at the back of the line. That's why I think when a lot of people are going to see a lot of hot takes about Bo Nix being the third quarterback on the depth chart. If you haven't seen them already, they're out there, and it means absolutely nothing because we all know, and if you've been listening to this show every day, you know, and if you haven't been listening every day, you would know that Bo Nix has been taking the majority of the first team reps. So ultimately, this unofficial depth chart really doesn't mean anything as it relates to the quarterback position.
Well, especially with Zach Wilson coming in listed as number 2. Look, here's the thing, and Sean, this has historically been how he's operated. He doesn't like these unofficial depth charts, which, look, the league mandates it before your first preseason game. I was a little peeved after practice because we're at the press conference, and anyone who was there last year on the beat, you know, we already know how Sean feels about these depth charts and things like that. I even put a tweet out the moment it came out. I said, I can't wait to see all the legendary, like in-depth, like think pieces that are going to be put out here because it means nothing. It really means nothing. Like this is like, hey, we're just going to put the list together. So, you know, Sean even said, I'd rather spend 5 minutes with Patrick Smythe versus 45 minutes trying to go over this whole entire thing. It's not going to matter at all in terms of that. And look, maybe there are some pieces here and there we'll piece together for, you know, this depth chart conversation here. But I think the number one thing here is that you're really trying to just figure out right now, like these coaches have more important things than their depth chart. And there's progress. And ideally, this is really going to formulate the real depth chart based on the preseason. Weeks 1, weeks 2, and weeks 3. Weeks 1's coming up here this Sunday against the Indianapolis Colts. You can expect a post-game report here, Locked On Broncos, Sayre Bedinger and myself breaking it down here. But in terms of Jarrett Stidham coming out, listed as quarterback 1, Zach Wilson 2, Bo Nix number 3, you already saw it. You know, some of these national outlets that have no idea what they're talking about, never send anybody to practice, say, well, Bo Nix has a lot of work to do. Well, I mean, ideally, I think, yeah, Bo has a lot of work to do because he's a rookie. But if you've been watching or paying attention to anything that Bo has been doing in practice, Bo has been putting in a lot of work and has been stacking days, has been looking really solid and consistent. We'll dive deep into he and Jarrett Stidham's performance during Tuesday's practice in a while. But the unofficial depth chart, I saw a lot of panic. Did you see it on your end? Like on social media, my feed was, wow, this is, I'm angry. This doesn't make any sense. I'm like, hey, don't get mad. Literally, it's not a big deal. Don't read into it. Just a little bit of hysteria here this afternoon.
Yeah, and I think it's super disingenuous of national media folks to say that Bo Nix has a lot of work to do because on the one hand, you're right. It's true. I mean, he's a rookie quarterback, but what they're implying is that he has a lot of work to do to climb out of this quarterback 3 hole, as opposed to what we know to be true, which is that he seems to be the clear favorite. Like, we just did an episode of the show a day or two ago about how it looks like he's running away with the starting job based on what you're seeing at practice, what others are seeing at practice, the reps that he's getting out there. So I just think it's lame, these narratives that get created. And if you want to know what the definition of clickbait is, it's that. It's people who have no idea what they're talking about, making ridiculous claims about something that appear on the surface to be true. Like, oh my gosh, Bo Nix is quarterback 3 in Denver. He obviously has work to do to get out of this hole. I guess it's not just the real ones that know, Cody. I mean, it certainly requires a little bit of kind of truth sifting at this stage, but it is frustrating because, I mean, the depth charts, when they come out, you have to understand it's all about seniority. We see stuff all over the depth chart that is indicative of seniority versus what we're seeing unfold in these roster competitions. Although I do think there are some aspects of the depth chart that may be worth looking into, namely if we want to stay on the offensive side of the ball. I mean, tight end, Adam Troutman, Greg Dulcich, Lucas Kroll listed as the top 3. Like, there are certain aspects of the depth chart that we can see that are accurate at this point.
Yeah, and I would even say too, like Garrett Bowles, Ben Powers. You look at obviously right guard Quinn Miners, Mike McGlinchey. Like, yeah, we know those ones are kind of set in stone. And I feel like for the most part, the defense is, in terms of how it was listed out, minus I would say cornerback right now. You Pat Surtain's the lock there, Jaquan and the nickel, but then for that cornerback 2 spot, it's Damari Mathis or Riley Moss. And then Sean Payton said after practice, you can also add or Levi Wallace to that mix as well. And really, I would say there's no questions beyond. Like, you look at linebacker, okay, it's Jonas Griffith or Cody Barton. So it kind of confirms that really that battle for them is between those two. Like, these are some of the definitives we can draw out of the unofficial depth chart as we go on. And I would even say to the point of Adam Troutman at tight end being listed as the starter. I mean, Troutman, like I said, isn't the most fastest tight end of the Broncos have, not the most athletic, but I'd say he's the most consistent in terms of what he brings to the table as a blocker and as a guy who can be a little bit of a possession guy for you on third down. And that doesn't mean, like, what has Sean historically told us, Sayre? He said, we're going to list like a starters, coming out, we're going to list our starters for a game, but that could change. He said that could include like a different personnel package. So Sean's not really buying into that, because I remember there was a game last year, like, I think it was the Kansas City Chiefs Thursday Night Football. Javonte Williams was fully healthy, but who got the first carries? Jaleel McLaughlin. So if you look at Pro Football Reference, he got credit for starting that game over Javonte, which we're going to read into it too much. Not really, but I'd say all those tight ends are going to probably play a big part of it. If we're looking at anything that's very like not on par, it's the quarterback rotation. If you've been paying attention, Bo has been getting a majority of the reps. Jarrett has gotten, a good portion of reps as well, but it's been primarily between these 2 quarterbacks at this point in time. So Broncos country, not a lot to worry about. And I promise you, look, if you're reading too much into this, take a step back and say, you know what, this is just an unofficial depth chart. And even when they come out with the starters in the preseason, that's not going to matter like necessarily. What matters is who are the starters week 1 of the NFL regular season. That is what matters the most here as we continue talking about it here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. And look, we talk about the depth chart. Well, there is a Broncos rookie wide receiver, maybe the most unlikely rookie to make the team. He's making a strong case during training camp, and we'll tell you why Devaughn Vele is a player to watch in the preseason. Up next here, Locked On Broncos. Broncos country, today's episode of the show is brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel Sportsbook. And look, summer has been intense as some of the seasons of the NBA, they dwindled down. The playoffs, the NHL, they came and went. MLB season is in full swing, and we've all been looking forward to the NFL season arriving. With training camp ongoing, the NFL preseason begins this week, and FanDuel Sportsbook is letting you get in on the action because this summer they're hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long, especially as we get into the NFL preseason. The Denver Broncos will hit the road this weekend to take on the Indianapolis Colts, and they will do that as 1.5-point underdogs. You can get in on the action over there at FanDuel Sportsbook, so make sure you check it out. Go to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. Once again, that's FanDuel.com. FanDuel is the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball and the National Football League.
Broncos rookie wide receiver Devaughn Vele may be buried on the official depth chart that was just released, but you know what? He's making waves at training camp, and he did just that on Tuesday. We're going to talk about Devaughn Vele's big day, as well as some comments that Sean Payton made after practice that may indicate the Broncos have a draft steal on their hands. But thank you so much to every single one of you that makes Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. And if you don't already, hit subscribe for free wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. And if you're on YouTube, you might as well check out for your second listen of the day, Locked On Fantasy Football, because if you're anything like me, you need other smarter people to do the research for you. And those guys over there at Locked On Fantasy Football, they do just that. So go ahead, give them a listen today. And Cody, look, I don't think we're necessarily going to be drafting Devaughn Vele unless you have a deep sleeper dynasty league or anything like that. But the guy might make some plays for the Denver Broncos offensively this year. You and I have discussed one of the key camp battles that we're going to be interested to watch unfold in the preseason games is at wide receiver. Now, the top four at this position are probably set in stone, even though we talk about a depth chart that's not set in stone at this point. I think the top four receivers are set in stone, but Devaughn Vele is out there making some plays, and he's been making an impression since he got, to the Denver Broncos back in May.
You mentioned like set in stone. It sounded like you said Sutton Stone, which Cortland Sutton is set in stone when it comes to making the 53-man roster this year, being number one on the depth chart. Bang! There we go. We're moving here. 110% agree with you. Devaughn Vele, and I tweeted it out during Tuesday's practice, just watching him. And look, not only in just like 7-on-7, not just team drills, but it's also like individual drills. Like they will do routes on air, and passing game coordinator Johnny Morton, like these guys will run over their landmarks in terms of routes. They will do it live, rapid fire. And he is on these guys very, very tightly about their depth, not showcasing maybe what they're running based on their stance or their leverage. Like he's very attention to detail because he's requiring these guys to take the next step. And I've watched like Johnny Moe pushes all these guys and coaches them really well. And he's on them. Sean Payton has talked about that. Devaughn Vele is a guy who I just consistently see getting better every single day. And in Tuesday's practice specifically, we'll go to, one-on-ones, we'll go to 7-on-7 and even team period. He's catching passes. And really what I'm saying is like, I'm not talking about just slant routes. I'm talking about back shoulders where, hey, he's got a defender in his chest. He's rising up and he's going over guys and mossing them, and he's hauling it in for touchdowns or big gains. He's doing things really well. And I would even say like his effort and scramble drill is definitely something on display. He is a squirmy guy. And look, I talked about Troy Franklin a couple of weeks ago saying, hey, I don't think that Troy's going to get featured as much in terms of training camp. Like you're not going to see him making a ton of plays. Watch him in the preseason. I would say after watching 2 weeks of training camp, I've also now added Devaughn Vele to this list because, look, you're not going to see Cortland Sutton, Tim Patrick. I don't think you're going to see these guys playing a ton in the preseason. You know who's going to play a ton? Troy and Devaughn Vele. And Devaughn Vele at wide receiver, Sean Payton mentions his catch radius. That stands out in a big way. But I'll also mention this. Make sure Broncos Country, when you're watching the game here on Sunday against the Colts, watch him if and when he gets in at the gunner position on punt. He is a player who's got speed, size. He could be a special player to watch. I don't know who I was telling. And look, I'm not trying to say he's going to be this guy. Obviously, the age bracket's different. From like, hey, like Puka Nacua came out of nowhere last year. Devaughn Vele may be a very under-the-radar type of guy in the same light. Now, that's a bold take. But I'm just saying, Broncos Country, don't be surprised if you see Devaughn Vele make the 53-man roster and all of a sudden he's playing big-time minutes at some point.
Yeah, you never know when talent is going to meet opportunity. I mean, that's the story of Puka Nacua, isn't it? It's just the opportunity that he had, and he already had the talent. It was just taking advantage of the opportunity. So I don't mind that, Cody. And I think, as you mentioned, we're not expecting to see a ton of Tim Patrick in the preseason. But you know what, Broncos Country? You're going to see number 81 out there running around all game long, and you're going to be like, man, that guy looks a lot like Tim Patrick. And then you're going to remember your boys, Cody and Sayre, talking about it on the show, because Tim Patrick now wearing number 12, Devaughn Vele wearing number 81. They went to the same college and all that. It's kind of crazy. They look very similar in pads and all these different things. So what is it that makes Devaughn Vele a special player, or what's making him stand out at practice? Well, Sean Payton said it. First of all, the vision for Vele as a player is inside out, meaning they see him as a big slot receiver who can play on the outside as well. They feel like they can maneuver him around and utilize him as a chess piece. I'm not going to say the word joker, Cody, because he's not a tight end or a running back, but he's somebody they feel they can move around the formation. And also, I think what's even more important that Sean Payton noted about him, he likes his size and strong hands in traffic. The ability to catch the ball away from his body is what he noted after Tuesday's practice. To me, that's where maybe the most apt comparison to Puka Nacua come into play, is that's what makes Puka Nacua so special. Other than his after the catch abilities, you got to be able to catch the ball first. You got to be able to catch the ball in traffic. And when you can do that at the highest level, you've got a 6'4" frame, Devaughn Vele does, and he's able to create separation at the catch point. You're able to create separation even if you don't have that cushion of, like, you know, somebody like a Jerry Jeudy who runs really quick routes and creates separation that way. Even if you don't create separation that way, the 6'4" frame allows you to get separation from defensive backs. And the Broncos are noticing this at practice. And I think he's going to get every opportunity to make an impact, especially if he's playing special teams. I wouldn't be surprised if Devaughn is active on the roster on game days before Troy Franklin. And I think they could both be weapons this year for the Broncos. But it's just an interesting scenario that I think as we get to this Colts preseason game, everybody in Broncos country should be excited to watch this wide receiver competition unfold.
Woo, I'm about to make a name for myself here. Make sure everyone knows what happened here today. Only the real ones know what that reference is from. But I mean, yeah, this is probably the one position group outside of running back and defensive back I am stoked to watch this week. These guys have been competing, and certainly Vele has been a guy. Like, the one thing I also like about him, you mentioned all those things. I think he does a really good job of tracking the football in the air vertically when he's downfield. Like, good patience, good eyes, and understands like when to turn his body, when to adjust, and when, you know, how to keep his feet in front of him, how to stay in bounds. Like, he is a smart football player. And here's the thing too. And look, I know people are going to say, well, he's 27 years old. You'd hope. It doesn't matter how old he is. Like, he's a rookie, and he looks like a very, very under the radar potential gem of a type receiver here for the Broncos group. And I'm just very curious to see how the vision kind of works out here. We mentioned outside in, inside out. Like, this is a guy who can play a little bit of anywhere here for Sean Payton. That makes the decisions, I think, come roster cut time a little bit more difficult. But if a guy like Vele, for example, continues to build on, I'd say, the training camp that he has had and goes out in the preseason and balls out, you simply cannot let him get away. We know Sean has highlighted that. I think Sean has an affinity for wide receivers that have like some size and the abilities that he does. And I think that Denver will have a very strong young nucleus of receivers going into the regular season. And I'm very curious to see how that gets amplified over time. And Devaughn Vele certainly can be one of those players. And look, I know we talk about things like, you know, hey, like we brought up Puka Nacua in terms of maybe like a comparison to him. Not saying he's going to produce like Puka, but just saying like, you know, nobody knew who really Puka Nacua was really until training camp a little bit. Like when he was taken by the Rams, I remember watching joint practices with Denver, and I'm like, Puka Nacua is good. Like, this guy is really, really good. And he goes on to have a really great regular season. Hopefully Devaughn Vele can be in that same conversation. Goes on to have a great regular season. Denver doesn't need him to be a number one, a number two, a number three, not even a number four. But man, if he can get, let's say he gets 20 to 25 targets as a rookie, and let's say he makes big plays happen, those you haul in a few touchdowns, or, you know, you're consistently moving the chains, Sean Payton will take that. I think Broncos country will take that as well. And there's a lot of reasons to be excited. And look, the reasons to be excited continue here as we evaluate players' positions and recap day 11 of day 12. Man, we're already cooking. Day 12 of Denver Broncos training camp here at Broncos Park, powered by Common Spirit. But a reason we're excited is that outside of Bo Nix, in terms of guys stacking days, we'll tell you why a couple of defensive backs the Broncos have on their roster continue to stand out in practice and what it may mean for the preseason here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. And when your schedule is packed with different activities, big work projects, and more, it's easy to let your priorities slip, and life can sometimes get in the way. Even when we know what makes us happy, it's hard to make time for it. But when you feel like you have no time for yourself, non-negotiables like therapy are more important than ever before. So make sure you take care of yourself. I've benefited from therapy in the past. I think it's super useful to be more in touch with what you need to do, be more self-aware. And that's what I utilized BetterHelp for in the past. I deal with stress, anxiety, some of those things that still, even to this day, get to me. I don't always have the answer. Life doesn't come with a playbook, but it also comes with solutions that you can do within yourself to help make things a little bit easier. And that's where I've utilized BetterHelp in the past. And the thing is, you fill out a brief survey, you get matched to a therapist. And if you vibe well with your therapist, you can continue on and obviously work on things that will help you out in the areas that you need. If you don't vibe with your therapist, you can change at any time at no additional cost to yourself. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and best of all, suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire and get matched with a licensed therapist. You can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. As we jump to the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, we'll highlight two defensive backs by the name of Jaquan McMillan and Chris Abrams-Drain, who are standing out, making plays during practice. We'll highlight some of the other standouts as well, some Broncos news and notes here on today's episode of the show. So we recap day 12 of Broncos camp. Just want to say once again, thanks to all the everydayers out there in Broncos country for making us your first listen. You can get us for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. So thank you so much for rocking with us here today. Kind of going over practice, really, I'd say Sean Payton was not very happy. I would say, coming out of it, and not like he was angry or anything, but he was at the podium and he just felt like they didn't have the type of practice that he wanted to. He mentioned something about them hitting a wall a little bit later on in practice. He said, I got to go watch the tape. And sometimes I go into, a session feeling like coming out of a practice, I don't feel like we practiced great today. He could be surprised, but he says we need to come out much more sharper coming out on Wednesday. So, I felt like Denver got a lot of good work in. Like Sayre, there was still some install emphasis going on. There was some 7-on-7. You saw some competitive periods. But I would say probably the more important period that we saw was the end of game, tie game, 21-21, 1 minute left. The Broncos offense has the ball. Jarrett Stidham got the first quarterback reps of the day. Bo Nix second, Zach Wilson third, which, hey, unofficial depth chart, something's off there if you're reading into it. Overall, it just felt like the offense did a solid job. They were able to move the ball downfield and they were able to capitalize.
Which is great to see from both guys, because ultimately we saw 67 different quarterbacks started games for NFL teams last year. So in today's NFL, what that stat tells me is that you've got to have two guys that could potentially go down and orchestrate a game-winning drive for you. And I think the Broncos do have that. Jarrett Stidham is a good player. I don't want that to get lost in this. There's the excitement of Bo Nix. You see it. I'm a fan of the Denver Broncos, have been since I was a little kid, Cody. The team has never drafted and developed a franchise quarterback. So you better believe that Broncos country, we're excited for Bo Nix. But man, if Jarrett Stidham can be a player, that helps the team in a variety of different ways. And so for him to go, and I believe he converted a 4th and 7 with a huge play to Cortland Sutton that got down to the 8-yard line, which is kind of where they ended his drive. Bo Nix getting in position for a 48-yard field goal, and both guys converting their opportunities, which there's nothing wrong with that. There's no aspect of this quarterback competition where I think anybody should be hoping that Jarrett Stidham plays poorly, because the Broncos, according to what we saw last year in the NFL and in Broncos recent history, how many quarterbacks have played, the likelihood of needing both guys to play at some point this season is pretty high, even though we all hope Bo Nix stays healthy if he's the day one starter. So I just think that it's great news all around to hear of these guys making throws, getting different receivers involved. Like, that's one thing that I noticed, Cody, as you share your practice notes with me. I see both Jarrett Stidham and Bo Nix completing passes to a variety of different receivers. One day it could be Stidham to Lucas Kroll and Bo Nix to Greg Dulcich, and the next day it's Stidham to Lil Jordan Humphrey and Bo Nix to Cortland Sutton. It's all these guys mixing and matching. I think in terms of this quarterback battle, yes, it does feel like Bo Nix is firmly ahead at this point to me from what I'm reading into it. But at the same time, for Jarrett to continue to stack good practices as well, because I don't think he's really had a lot of bad practices this offseason, feels like that's good news for the Broncos, even in a competition like we're in.
100%. And look, it's not just at quarterback, it's also at cornerback. And look, while we're so focused on, hey, who's going to start Damari Mathis, Riley Moss, or Levi Wallace opposite of PS2, there are a couple of defensive backs that are already on the roster that are playing terrific. And look, I think there's one player defensively in the secondary that I feel like has had just an absolute studdish training camp consistently day in and day out. It has been Jaquan McMillan, which looks, Sarah, I don't think comes as a surprise to you or I, considering what we saw from him. And I think even like after his rookie season where we were talking about, hey, he got in the last game of the regular season, balled out, like, okay, this guy's got some potential. And then he goes out and he, steps in for the Broncos. And then it was a big part of the, catalyst. Like, I think he was the fourth leading tackle for a lost player on the team. He didn't even start the first 3 weeks of the season. He has a nose for the football. He had a play during team period today where the Broncos tried getting a pass out really quickly to a running back. And man, did Jaquan McMillan shoot against the block, maintain outside leverage, and blow it up for what would have been a 3 or 4 yard loss. He is playing with confidence, not only against, the ball when it's in the air, but also against the run. And I'm excited to see him. He's standing out in a big way. Rookie cornerback Chris Abrams-Drain, fellow Mizzou alumni, here he's grown consistently from OTAs really to training camp. And I thought we saw a little bit more on Monday's practice when they did one-on-ones. It was like Abrams-Drain, he's doing a really good job getting in phase, making plays on the football, covering really well, showcasing discipline with his eyes, his footwork, his technique inside the goal line red zone. Comes out during Tuesday's practice and also does the same exact thing. Like he had a nice pass breakup. I'm trying to remember. I think it was against Cortland Sutton, if I'm not mistaken, or Tim Patrick was one of those two guys down the left sideline on a fade route where, they go to make the play. He puts his hand through the receiver's hands, knocks it away, like sticky coverage. Like he's gaining more confidence. And I think he's also a player that Broncos Country should keep their eye on here, specifically this Sunday preseason opener. Been very pleased with what we've seen from the secondary guys there. But I mean, it's also a little interesting today too, Sarah, because we opened things up and I was trying to figure out, I was like, who's number 23? I don't know who this guy is walking on the field. Happens to be Andre Smith, who was number 46 yesterday, was number 96 just 2 days ago. And so I was like, all right, who's this guy? Well, there's a reason the Broncos did some number shuffling and things like that. Well, they brought back undrafted rookie inside linebacker Alec Mock out of Air Force, who they had on the team, and they gave like a waived injured designation to Ronnie Perkins, defensive end. And I'm guessing that's probably more so a technicality for Inyoma Uwazurike versus anything else, but they needed an extra linebacker with Justin Sternad dealing with a groin injury.
Yeah, and I think it's good that they brought Mock back because you look at his production at Air Force and you see a guy that you definitely would like to get a look at in the preseason. And of course, as Sean Payton talks about, you don't want to let a guy get away and then have him go be productive somewhere else and wonder, well, what did we miss when we were evaluating him? So you bring back a guy that you had convictions about. I believe that's the second time they've done that in the last week or so, Cody, with the offensive lineman from Colorado State that they brought back. I'll have to look at the depth chart to figure out what his name is, unless you find it here before me. But
it's something Oliver or something like that. Colorado State offensive lineman.
You know what? Let's find it right now because I've got Oliver Jervis from Colorado State. So there we go. We got it. Oliver Jervis and his family. There's the shout out on the podcast. I hope he does well in the preseason as well. So, but I like bringing back Alec Mock. It's disappointing to see Ronnie Perkins get waived injured. But I guess maybe that's the trade-off when you're bringing in somebody like Inyoma Uwazurike and you have guys like Thomas Incoom off the edge coming through, Jalen Allen, Darrell Nchami, all these other guys that are playing well off the edge. Dondre Tillman, I saw in your notes today, Cody, had a would-be sack in one of his reps. And I know people in the comments have asked about Dondre Tillman as well. So he's another guy that, man, as we get to this preseason game against the Colts, how many guys are we gonna even be able to do just one episode of all the players that we're excited about watching in the preseason game against the Colts? I mean, we want to see all 90 guys, but there's so many players this year, Cody, that I'm like, man, I'm really excited to see what he does in a game. And I keep saying that over and over again. So Just the procedural moves, though, and certainly adding to the competition. More likely, I would say, with these types of moves for the practice squad than the 53-man roster.
Yeah, and look, everything's going to fluctuate as well. The Broncos dealing with some injuries to some guys. We know Levi Wallace, Brandon Jones, two guys dealing with a hamstring injury. Nick Bonito dealing with some sort of back issue there. Now, he was present at practice today, but I don't think he did too much. Like, they're trying to be smart with him. And look, obviously with backs, you got to be careful. And I'm not sure if it's a muscle thing or if it's structural, whatever it may be, but it's obviously worth monitoring. We're going to be watching Wednesday's practice to kind of keep an eye on, okay, hey, the Broncos ideally, I think, will be focused Broncos on Wednesday. I think Broncos in the first half of practice, then they start shifting gears to Indy. Fridays and Indy practice, and then a Saturday you're traveling. Sunday it's game time, 11 a.m. Mountain Time. So obviously a lot of moving pieces this week. It is a game week here for the Broncos, but there's still a lot of Broncos work that they need to do internally here. So we'll continue to monitor and we'll bring you updates every single day. And look, Broncos Country, if you're an everyday listener, here's what you can expect on tomorrow's episode of the show. We'll go over what we learned from Wednesday's practice, any new developments coming out of the quarterback competition. Jarrett Stidham got the reps on Tuesday. Is it Bo that gets it on Wednesday? You have to tune into tomorrow's episode to find out. But really, thank you so much for making us your first listen of the day every single day. Don't forget, for your second listen after the show, go check out the Locked On Fantasy Football podcast to help you prepare for your fantasy leagues this season. We'll catch you tomorrow for a brand new episode of the show.